All right, James, welcome to the Micro Collector podcast. I'm super excited to have you on today.
I am excited to be here, having conversations back and forth and DMs and comments and all that fun stuff. But yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say that, first of all, your watch, the Wormhole, has been following me around Instagram. I see it everywhere. It's not a watch that you forget, right? It really is one of those scroll stoppers. But also, I find that every time I see a watch that I like and I'm in a comment thread, suddenly I see your handle as well in there. So you've been making the rounds on Instagram and we seem to be hanging around in the same circles. So I was really excited to have the opportunity to chat and hear a little bit more about your story today.
Great. Yeah, man. It's we are a genuine community driven brand. I'll say that and we'll dive into that. But yeah.
I've definitely noticed that, and I see unity all over your branding and so on. So it definitely comes through. But maybe for those that don't know you, don't know Canuck Timepieces, give us a little bit of your background. And I'm always interested in hearing how folks get into watches in the first place. If there's a story on the first watch you got or when you first noticed watches out there in the world, it'd be really interesting to hear.
Yeah. So bit of my background. So I live about an hour and a half outside of Toronto. I did grow up just outside the city in another major city down the road from Toronto called Hamilton. It's the Pittsburgh of Canada, a steel town. And I heard that from Eugene Levy recently. So that's perfect for where he's actually from, Hamilton.
Oh, really?
So I grew up, I wouldn't say surrounded by watches, but I grew up being aware of watches. I was born in 1989, so I grew up in the 90s, and that was before smartphones, was before, you know, texting even. And the reality is I wore a watch. Like it was one of those things that I wore, like the typical Timex, I don't even think it was the kids ones. I think it was just like an Iron Man or something. But the first watch I remember vividly was I had to look up the name for it, like at some point, because it was like a Nike sports watch. And I think it was like the Triax is the one that like keeps making, but it was like some cheap version, right? So it just had the shape of what people know as the Triax, but it was just like a simple digital watch. And, at the time, when I say I was around watches, my father's in the financial industry. So in the 90s, many people do know that was kind of the rise of the financial world and how advisors made their money and whatnot. And so he would go to Omaha, Nebraska, which is where Warren Buffett used to hold a conference, and he would always come back. I still remember the name of the store. I have no idea if it's still around. It's called Borsheim's. And I guess it's like, that's where all like the wealthy, when they visited, went in to buy a watch from Borsheim's in Omaha. And my dad would always come home with, something. And I remember the first watch that I remember, and he still has actually, was, again, I had to look it up years later, was the Hamilton Ventura, the Men in Black watch. I knew it as the Men in Black watch forever. And, my dad also had like the Ray-Bans from Men in Black. And he's like, look, I have both. And especially at the time, I guess that was like late 90s, him coming back with, a watch and, being special to him. He then, had tags and Breitlings and never had anything, I guess, upper like beyond that. And I think that's just because, we did a lot of traveling, and I think, that was the reasoning why he didn't go above that. Plus he wasn't like a watch enthusiast. He just had it for clients. Right. And that kind of was the stigma on maybe why the watch world wasn't for me for a very long time. And, I've had these conversations and yes, the head nod, where it's like, there is a certain stereotype of someone that owns a watch because it's a watch, not because it's somewhere to, or something to keep time with. Right. And I don't have, an architectural design background. I don't have the typical background of a lot of these designers. But I've always loved design. I've always loved fashion. I've always loved architecture, and it's always fascinated me. And I go full nerd when it comes to, diving into, you know, why something is the way it is. Uh, and I think that's what led me through the design, architecture, fashion, and cars is like my forever favorite hobby. And then, you know, I'll fast forward all the way to now with how it's transitioned to the brand, right? Like for Canuck and being able to bring all that knowledge into something that I never thought I'd be into. And, I come from sales, e-commerce, customer support background, social media, and, I can't draw. And so I never thought it would be something I would be able to do, just enjoy. And bringing me into the space that I'm in really has to do with, being introduced to microbrands a couple years ago. And it got rid of that stigma for me. Cause like when I first started getting back into watches not that long ago, like 3 years ago, I started with Casio, and I still believe, even people who are not into watches and they ask me what should I own? And I tell them every single time Casio A15A8, A158. And if you want the brighter background, A168. And and people ask, really? It's 25 or $30. And I'm like, yeah, but everyone knows it. You could be an enthusiast that has a Rolex or a Patek and notice someone who has a Casio A158 on and compliment it, ironically enough. And that's, what I found. It almost like killed the stereotype when I had the Casio, where it's like a guy that has a Rolex goes, oh, I like your, oh, I used to have one of those. Oh, that's a great watch. And again, it like got rid of the stigma where I realized it's more of the enthusiasts that are not like the typical stereotype, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and it totally resonates with me. I mean, a lot of it. First of all, I have a Ventura, like a newer version, and
Amazing.
I was going to ask you, if you think subconsciously that sort of led you down a certain design path when you were thinking about, the black hole and the wormhole and all these things, because even without being tied to Men in Black, it's a very futuristic looking
Oh
watch. It
yeah.
always has been. So I'd love to hear your perspective on that. But also, I just wanted to comment on the Microbrand story is exactly aligned with sort of me. As a kid, I also had the Casios, the Timexes. I had a little bit of a swatch phase, but never sort of crossed the bridge of, let's say, I wouldn't say luxury watches, but dress watches or, stainless steel bracelet watches or anything like that until a little bit later in my life when I started to see that actually there were watches out there that were accessible and that weren't just cheaper versions of the luxury watches, but actually had their own design language and had a story behind it in terms of the founder and like an attention to detail that was actually really interesting. I'm curious on that front, do you remember the microbrand that first sort of pulled you in where you were like, oh, wow, this is really interesting? Um, and sort of what it was about that watch that drew you to it.
Yeah. So there's two. One's Indonesian based and one's American based. So Lima,
Okay.
the Chrono
Yeah.
Sprinter, the first time I saw that watch, I was like, oh, that's cool. I didn't know you could do that. I didn't know you could design something like that. I didn't know you could make a quality watch that looks like that. Right. And then Brew, you know, and it's funny because I am not and I think this is why I am not a chronograph person. I'm not a huge fan of chronographs. I'm a fan of them visually. I think they look beautiful. However, which is probably why I was drawn in by both of them, because similar, fun, yet artistically different styles of watches between the Brew Metric and the Lima Chrono Sprinter, right? And between those two, especially with chronographs, the reason why I don't like chronographs is because I like movement. I like movement on my, and it's like, oh, well, you can just press the button. I'm like, yeah, but like then I run through power. Like it doesn't make sense. Like there's, let's say it doesn't make sense. How about that? Like I appreciate them. And I will probably own one of them in the future. Actually, I have a brew. What am I saying? I have a retrograph, it's the all loom dial,
Very
which I
cool.
won from the Dansum actually, because I'm like, whoa, yeah, I would love to own one. But, similar to how I like to, like watches that I love are vintage watches, believe it or not. And both of them have vintage aesthetic in some way. Obviously, Brew being more obvious with the 1970s inspiration. I find that Lima's watches do have uh, as someone who went complete nerd into looking into design from the 1900 all the way up to 1990s, you can see inspiration with the Chronos printer. But those two brands are what made me look and find a way to make something myself. And it's interesting because when I get asked this all the time, how do you start? What do you do? It's like, okay, so there is an MOQ, so you can't just make whatever watch you want. My approach was I wanted to learn how to make one first before I started designing. So I did the AliExpress trick where I buy a $20 case, at the time a $40 NH movement, which is not what they cost anymore. And, a couple, like the hands are like $5 and, buy a strap for $5, like enough that if you make a mistake, it's not the end of the world. And you buying cheap little tools as well, like a whole kit is like 20 or $30 for everything you ever need to make a watch, hilariously enough. And I come from, you know, the sneaker streetwear, you know, area of Instagram where I love sneakers. I love all that. Like I have a collection. It was close to 100 at one point, but it's down now since doing this. But I still love sneakers. And, I am going to NYC this weekend, which is the mecca of sneakers, in my opinion. But uh, I think what makes it all interesting is bringing it back into the watches and comparing it to where sneakers was. The reason why I burned out with sneakers is there's only so much you can do with a sneaker. Meaning, iconic design is iconic design. Same thing with watches. However, seeing Microbrands, seeing Lima, seeing Brew, seeing Seconte Cone and Romeric doing what he does, it opens a whole new level that still doesn't look cheap, doesn't look custom. It looks like it should in a fun way. And sneakers, if you want to make a sneaker, good luck with that. That's like you buy a sewing machine that's $5,000. Like it's not just a simple sewing machine to get through leather, make the sole, all this stuff. And also, I'm sure you see it, like it's brand dominated, just like any other field is, but there's a reason for it, or else it looks like a cheap, no offense, Skechers shoe or a Timu shoe or something. Like it's very easily, it looks very cheap very easily. And watches, I found once I got into the microbrand exploration, it was a breath of fresh air that you didn't have to stay within the typical Submariner, Explorer, look. You could SKX, SMK, like, I mean, the typical standard cases. You didn't have to do that. And like I said, Lima and Brew were 100% that for me.
Yeah, Brew was actually my gateway. I actually, now that you're sort of talking through some of these models, I did buy an SKX 007 and a
Of
009 like
course.
most people. As I started collecting, I heard from others and I saw on YouTube that these were like the collector's entry points. So I got those. But very soon after that, I came across a video with Teddy Baldazar and Jonathan from Brew. And I, like you kind of mentioned, it was just so unique, the design. It felt familiar but unique. And the retro 1970s inspired design with a more modern use of color, not overstated, but sort of like in there, really drew me in. And yeah, that was my gateway. But I wanted to ask you, so you bought, from AliExpress, these components to put together. How do you go from that to then being like, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to launch a brand. I'm going to come out with several lines now, collaborations? How do you go from that starting point to where you are today?
So I'm not going to mention this person by name just because they're very private, but there's someone based in Singapore that started following my personal account, which was completely sneaker dominated. But I started posting watches, and I had made my first watch and I posted it. And I was very proud of it, of what I put together. This person started following me, and I find out, I became honestly friends with them. So I've known them for 2 years now. We've been chatting, and it's interesting because you get to this point with them where you talk more outside of watches, and it's a genuine relationship, right? And something that he said early on was, "Oh, I love that design." Like usually modders and stuff, like usually it's just the same, but how did you come up with that? How did you, and he was asking me questions. And then I did a few more, and he was like, "Oh, you need to start like a brand or something." And I'm like, "No." I said, I'm not a designer. I just do it for fun. I enjoy it, but like, no, no, I'm fine." And you know, I go to the Toronto Timepiece show the first year, so 2 years ago, and it was eye opening for me to see just the different microbrands that were available. I hate to not mention the brands that spoke to me, but like I will say Geo and GeoShop and Visitor, based in Indiana. The two of them were, so Geo, just on his energy and how just down to earth he was. And I showed him, my custom watch, and he was like, "Oh, that's so cool." And he was like giving me small feedback, but not rude. Right. And it was, like, "Oh, have you thought of this?" And just like, like try it this way. And it was genuine. And I'm like, okay, this is like not what I expected. And most of the brands were not feeling it that way. And then also I forget the visitor owner's name. It's been a while since I've chatted with him, but you know, his case stood out to me, his hand stood out to me, and the story behind it. And it's too big for my wrist. But uh, seeing just like the community and how welcoming it can be, not from everyone, but from just a couple people, getting to know the owner who runs the Toronto event, now Montreal and Vancouver. Jason, shout out to him. Um, I started going to events, and come January last year, so a year ago, I decided to do customs. Just because like I had people that were like, "Oh, why don't you can you make this for me? Have you tried doing this?" And I'm like, "Hmm." And through this connection in Singapore, I was added to like a small little chat group with myself, three others in Singapore, and one person in Bali, in Indonesia. And by the way, we still have that channel, or we still have that chat. There's still only, we've added one expert. We're 5 or 6 of us, and very, uh, very honest chats about watches, right? One of them is Loathe Watches, who makes his own watch, like movement, everything, right? And so it's cool to hear a background of that and how that's made. But after 2 months, I had made I'd made like 4 or 5 watches, and no, in 3 months I made 4 or 5 watches. The last one I made was something that allowed me to explore my design thought process a little bit more. It was the collector in Bali, and he had asked me to, or he didn't ask me directly. He just said, "I wonder if you can, or someone can make this pin, enamel pin, into a watch, to a watch dial." And I said, "I can try it. Why not?" So I had my Dremel. And if anyone knows the thickness of watch dials, usually it's between zero point 0.5 and zero point 0.9, maybe zero point 0.8 usually. Yeah, so that was 2.1 millimeters that I had to slice down bit by bit. And, I made it, and I found out that friends from in that group who saw him, like, "No, no, he wears it. It's on his like bedside table." I'm like, "Oh, that's an honor, right?" And little did I know this person had watches that I can only dream of, like Pateks and Vacherons. And I'm like, oh my goodness, not knowing much about this person, then getting to know them. And between them and the people in the group, they're like, "You need to do a brand. Stop doing customs." And I'm like, no, like, maybe. And so it's funny, I launched the custom in May or in January, sorry. And then in May is when I relaunched uh, to become the brand. And that was the Unity. So, getting to that and exploring and outright, the Unity is a mod case. I'm not going to lie. So I'm not going to lie because I didn't make I made maybe 5% markup, right? If that on that watch. And I don't have a problem saying that. I'm okay being transparent. And uh, that was more about proof of concept than it was about making money. And I think sometimes that gets lost in all the micros that you see come out. I think there's a lot of genuine, but I think with a lot of like copy and paste brands, they're in it because it's the hot thing. And it's like, oh, well, I can do that. I can. And if they have a big marketing background and they have the money to spend on a Kickstarter and marketing, they're going to succeed. And that's unfortunate for someone like myself or even Ryan or, my goodness, Alt, Altsum, is that? Alt
Philip.
Symmetry.
Yeah, Philip.
Philip. And,
Alternative symmetry.
you know what I mean? Like I look at Phillips and I'm like, that's a lot in a good way. And if he had the marketing background and the money of the marketing of some of the other brands that have been successful, I think he would also be successful. But, I think it's we've chatted, obviously, Philip and I, as well as Ryan and I, of course, they've been on here. Uh, and I said earlier about a genuine connection. And, it's funny because I said I kind of like fused into the Unity and that's it. But like, from that point forward, by the way, I only sold two of those in a 2-month span. So, and I only had 5. It wasn't until the black hole. So, the grind is real. And again, I think going into it with a passion rather than thinking, oh, I'm going to make money off this. I think bringing in the passion, showcasing that passion, being involved in the community, I think speaks volumes. It's a slower growth, but it's a real growth, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and one thing that I've noticed about all your watches, you mentioned Unity, Black Hole, we talked about Wormhole a little bit, and I'd love for you to also talk through each one of them and kind of highlight a little bit about them. But every one of them is a collaboration. So when you talk about Unity and you talk about not the model, but Unity as a concept, and
Yeah.
you talk about community, you're not just speaking, you're practicing that through your watches. At what point did you realize that you wanted to take approach of collaboration as sort of your go-to-market? And again, maybe you can talk us through some of the watches and maybe also some of the benefits and the challenges that come with collaborations, because I do think collaborations is a bigger thing now in watches, right? Not just in the microbrand segment, definitely in the microbrand segment, but I mean, we saw even with Swatch and Omega under the Swatch group, right? The Moon Swatch, technically a collaboration, but like there's many, many more that we can point to as well. It definitely seems to be, I guess, a tool in the toolkit that people are using. You're using it, at the core of your brand, meaning that every single watch that you've launched is a collaboration. And it seems, from what I've seen, like a very tight knit collaboration. Yeah, where did that decision come from? And tell us a little bit about that journey.
Yeah. So I believe that as a Canadian, the best way to show Canada to the world is through unity, in my personal opinion. I think that best represents Canada. We're not perfect at anything. We're not, the best at anything. But there's something that, I think most people in the world think about it, in the sense of it's Canada, they're nice, whatever. But I think at the heart of it, it's not about being nice or polite. I think it has to do with being able to collaborate with others, being able to have a relationship with others. And so I believe at the heart of my brand being unity made unique. I want to be unique. I think Canada represents unity, and I think Canada is unique And how we are unique is because we are a mosaic, if you want to call it that. We don't call it a melting pot. We call it more of a mosaic or a quilt, I've heard, where, we don't have, a lot of people are like, oh, Canada, like what, like I love food. We don't have anything other than poutine. We really don't. We have Nanaimo bars. We have things that typically aren't like a full cuisine. Do you know what I mean? Like you can't go, oh, that's a Canadian cuisine. You really can't. And but I don't see that as a weakness. I see that as a strength. Like you come to Toronto, it is every single type of food from every single country. Or not every single, but like almost every country. And, if you're a basketball fan, Raptors run, Serge Ibaka, who was with the Raptors, he's from Congo. Guess what? He had a Congolese restaurant, or not him. There was a Congolese restaurant already existing. And he said, I haven't had Congolese food since I left the Congo and moved to France when I was a teenager, but I was able to have it in Toronto. And I'm like, I think that just shows you, it doesn't matter, and talk about the unity of a city, right? We know New York's like that. We know LA's like that, just in different capacity. Um, but yeah, so that's how I figured a collaboration, but not just a collaboration. It's more of, I would say it's more of a partnership in that release than it is a collaboration. Cause I think a collaboration sometimes doesn't have like deep roots, and it's just like, okay, let's collaborate. Let's do this together. We have similar styles, whatever. Right. And when I did the Unity with Juxposed, who's based in Colorado, it was because I found his Surfite dials on Etsy a year prior, hilariously enough. And I just saved it. And unfortunately, in April, when I chatted with him, that was kind of like Canada, US early stages of what's going on currently. But I said, hey, I'm not sure if you're open to this, but I love your Surfite dials. I want to launch a brand. It'll only be 5 pieces. Would you be open? I want to call it Unity because Canada and the US. And not political, just, hey, we're in this together. It's fine. And he was on board right away. And that kind of made it, you know, I'm like, okay, this will work, being based on Unity. And, I guess fuse it into meeting I'll just say Ando. I'll just say Ando. And when I met Ando, net. I had been following Ando for about a year because originally he started doing mod cases, but unique mod cases. So I'd been following him based on how unique his cases were. I'm like, this is so cool. And I was bugging him because he kept posting on his story. I was bugging him from my personal account. I should note that. I was bugging him about like this Millennium Falcon spaceship case. And he kept only in his stories. And I was like, so I messaged him like, hey, if you're ever, you know, open to like selling a prototype, let me know. And he's like, oh, well, it might go live. I might do a whole run. I said, oh, okay. And I think like 3 weeks after, the second time I bugged him, he messaged me and he goes, do you want one? And I'm like, yeah. And he goes, okay, and I paid, a little less than around what the cost was. Cause he's like, I just need to get rid of them because it's not going to happen. And, I got it. I already had an idea in my head. I posted it on my personal account. I woke up the next morning. This is like the Unity had been released at this point. I posted on my personal account, and overnight I had by far the most amount of likes I've had on a watch post on my personal account because it wasn't a watch account. And a DM from him saying, hey, do you want to do this? Do you want to make it? And I'm like, yeah. He's like, but we have to change the hands. He's like, do you have any ideas? I said, do I have any ideas? Got ideas. So it was kind of like my intro as well to the back end of making a watch that wasn't just brought together with parts, but brought together through manufacturing and, MOQs and costs of that and this and molds and figuring all that out. Was a success, obviously, the launch. And it quickly became my, I guess, like signature handset. I had always wanted to do a curved handset. Someone else has already done it, and I think Alfaro in the UK. So I didn't want to copy them because I think what they did was outstanding. And so I wanted to make my own spin on it. And yeah, the Black Hole series has started the snowball. I'll go right to like essentially the wormhole from the black hole. Interstellar is my favorite movie of all time. So that is the basis of the series and why I did it. But yeah.
Very cool. And I believe if I'm not mistaken, there is a watch that a lot of collectors are pretty enthusiastic about in Interstellar. I think it's a Hamilton watch as well. So
Hamilton,
there's that
uh,
connection there.
yeah, the Murph in quotes.
Cool. Um, one last question I had for you. You kind of touched on it, but I think, I mean, what I'm seeing is there seems to be a little bit of a movement when it comes to watches in Canada.
Mm,
You know, especially in the microbrand segment. Obviously met you now. I've had Ryan at Makoto on. In a couple weeks, I'm going to have Thomas from Tesse on as well. And more, I'm finding new microbrands that I'm like, oh, from Canada. And you mentioned there's 3 events
yeah,
now as well in Canada. Is this my imagination, or do you think there is a little bit of a movement going on right now when it comes to watches, microbrands, and Canada? And what do you think, if so, like if this is a real thing, what do you think's the reason behind it?
obviously, or I guess the obvious would be I think microbrands are kind of growing everywhere. But I'll say, Jason and the team that originally started the Toronto Timepiece show 2 years ago. It was just a small event, dark event, just because of where it was, and he wasn't sure how many people would show up. To last year's event that was huge. They had an award show. Um, I think a lot of that is mainly, you know, I guess showing that Canada is is here. But more importantly, that we're a small country by population. Only we have 41 million, and I think if we look at microbrands as a whole, like it's going to be from either Switzerland, UK, the US, and I will lump Asia, unfortunately, together just because there are so many in that pocket. And I think with Canada at least, I think that we just want to say, hey, we're here too. We have people that design. We're not you know w- I don't know how to explain it without like sounding like, oh, this guy's all Canada, Canada. I said, but the reality is like we have a lot of talented artists and designers here. We see that in other arts like acting and comedy, and like we're a small country, but we when we go into something of a hobby or you know a trade or anything like that, like we really want to do right by it. And you know I named it Canuck. It's hilarious because my Asian friends and customers asked me, what does Canuck mean? Like, this is before, like, I explained it in videos, right? And I said, "So it just means Canadian." That's all it means. It was honestly, it was a negative slur before 1890, I think. And what had happened, like, because it was all the Europeans that had come over and they call people that were originally from here Canucks. And what happened was around that 1890s, early 1900s, they're like, no, this is good. We're Canadian. Canuck, this is great, which is why there's a hockey team named after it, right? At the end of the day. And I didn't want to pigeonhole myself to be, oh, it's Canada, Canada watches, right? And pigeonhole myself into being Canada, Canada, Canada. I wanted to separate it with that, but also have a unique name that was catchy enough. And, it's ironic because half of my customers are American and about a quarter are Canadian, and the rest of the world is another quarter. you know, I think I have a very good, uh, like it's important to me to have that genuine connection, like I said. And, I don't know if you were going to ask this question or not, but because I don't have the marketing dollars, I think it's important to be genuine and have connection and engage with your followers, with your customers, with like I support other micro brands, which is another thing where it's it's like frowned upon in every other like, physical product world, right? And I remember the surprises of, going to events and, my like content creator friends are like, how do you know all the brands? You're a brand. I'm like, yeah, because like I talk to them. And because I when I appreciate a brand, I want to speak to them. When they're doing something different, I want to support them because if they succeed, I'll succeed. Because and that's something I noticed very quickly, you know, when I went to Singapore, it kind of brought it all together where a lot of these brands, they want to talk to me or I want to talk to them because of being unique. Because and it's welcoming and they want everyone to succeed within this like micro brand bubble, which doesn't exist in other aspects of, sneakers, clothing. Like everyone's against each other in every other category. And seeing how welcoming other micros are because you support them and they them will support you is honestly very Canuck, very unity based, right? And it's like it's a special connection. And again, it's slow growth, doing engagement, doing it the way I've done it. But I also like I try not to be fake. And the reality is when you see me commenting, it's not because I'm doing a token comment. I'm doing it because I want to and I love it and I enjoy it, which is why in person, when I go to events, I think it's important as a brand to talk to other brands so that we can help each other and not be against each other all the time. But yeah, so
Yeah, I think that's one of the special things about the microbrand space. It attracted me in the first place as well. And I think, you are living true to those values. I don't know if I mentioned this to you previously, but, when I do these recordings, when I meet new founders at the end, I usually ask, hey, are there any other microbrand founders out there that you think I should have on the podcast that I should meet with that has an interesting story to tell? And three have mentioned your name, like
when I
three in a
saw that,
row.
when you sent me that, I'm just like, "Oh, that's kind of nice." They said
So
I
you're
didn't think of it.
you're living true to that community, to that unity message. And it's fun to watch. It's fun to see you succeed, and it's very easy to cheer you on because I think anybody can get behind unity and collaboration and communication in the world that we live in today. So keep doing what you're doing, and thanks for making the time today
Thank you, Jeff.
to stop by and share your story with us. If folks want to follow along, where are the best places to follow? And also, anything for us to keep an eye on? I know Wormhole is out there. It looks like there's a couple left, but you guys are getting close to
Yeah,
to
yeah.
to
There's
the finish line
9.
on that. But anything else? Any other collaborations? Any other sneak peeks or little
Yeah.
things that you can share here today that people can get excited to follow along for?
Yeah, so there's 9 left of the 30. It's more watches that I've sold in the entire existence of the brand so far, or equal to it, which is exciting. I do have my signature watch that I'm going to be releasing. There is some delays because something didn't turn out the way I wanted to. So originally I was going to have something by March in hand that I could start promoting. That probably won't happen until May, which is when I had planned to release it originally, but it will be ready by the time I go to Oro Chronos at the end of May. I will have the prototypes for it in hand. I'm very excited about it. It's fusing my love of vintage with my love of futuristic styling. So think of Fallout or Back to the Future in the sense of what does it look like 30 years from now? Well, right now we think of it like this, not what it'll actually be, right? Like we didn't think we'd all have smartwatches that were the size of a tiny watch. I think everyone thought they'd be huge, like things like, oh, look, it's going to be awesome and holograms, and there's no holograms involved. Just like, but but yeah, there's that. Later in the year, there's going to be part 3 of Ando and I's. It is the final within this series to complete it. The black hole, then you get sucked into a wormhole, and where you end up is the 4th dimension. So it'll be called that. So I'm excited about that. Again, you'll see me Oro Chronos. I'll be a vendor in Toronto in September, and hopefully I'm back in Singapore at the beginning of November this year. But yeah.
Very cool. Well, James, thanks again for stopping by. Lots of exciting things to follow along. I'll include some links in the show notes as well to your Instagram, your website, so people can follow along. And yeah, have a great rest of your day over there.
Oh, good timing of the dog I was just gonna go like that.
Saying goodbye to us.
Oh, Sully, good job. Good job, buddy.